What's the scariest story you've ever heard? Real or fake, internet or not? Story 1. About 10 years ago, I was recently divorced and living alone in a one-bedroom apartment. The place was clean and the rent was decent. One of those places that had a doorman. I felt safe here. I was alone and loving it, focused on my career and not on my clingy ex-husband. Things were finally looking up for me. At the time, I was working pretty late at the office and would often stumble into my apartment sleep-deprived in the early hours of the morning and wake up by 6:30, 7-ish to start the day. I started noticing that in the morning, my door would be unlocked sometimes. I usually dismissed this as my sleep-dead brain, thinking that the bed looked more appealing than locking the door. Another thing that I noticed since moving in was that I seemed to misplace things more than I used to. Little things like a hairbrush or nail polish, that sort of thing. It wasn't really that big of a deal, just enough to be a slight annoyance in my day. The longer I lived there, the more frequently I seemed to forget to lock the door. At first it was every once in a while, then it seemed like an almost daily occurrence. More things went missing. Things like pictures, shaving razors, and most disturbingly, my underwear. This went on for long enough that I started to get a little paranoid. I started to take the time at night to make sure the door was locked. I got into a habit of every night after I locked the door to turn the handle 3 times and say to myself, "It's locked, it's locked, it's locked." Time after time I would wake up and the door would be unlocked. One time I even tried staying up all night to watch the door, but I ended up falling asleep in my chair. I decided that my mind was not reliable enough to stay up all night, so I invested in a video camera. I went all out and bought the fanciest camera that I could get my hands on. So one night, I set the camera up facing the door. I hid the camera under a pile of towels on the floor. I locked the door and went to bed. When I woke up, my apartment looked normal. Nothing missing that I could see. I decided to check the tape. I fast-forwarded through hours of footage, not seeing anything. I was just about to give up when I noticed the handle of the door jitter. Then it slowly crept open. A figure slid through the half-open door and walked towards the camera. It paused, looked around as if it was listening for something, then walked forward into direct view of the camera. I paused the camera, and the hairs on my arms and the back of my neck started to rise. I was staring directly into the face of the maintenance man of the building. I could see those big, thick glasses and curly hair. I had no doubt who it was. I played the tape a little more. He looked comfortable as he walked around the apartment. Then he turned and walked towards my bedroom and out of the view of the camera. I didn't know what to do. Sobbing, I called the police. I tried to explain over the phone, but couldn't. Soon enough, 2 officers arrived at my doorstep. I told them everything and showed them the tape. I remember seeing the blood drain from their faces. They promised me that I was safe and that they were going to get this guy. They needed to lie down but didn't want to be alone. One of the officers offered to stand outside my apartment door as I took a nap. As I was laying in bed, unable to sleep but too drained to move, something kept nagging at me. I lay there for a few minutes tossing and turning, unable to get comfortable or rest. My mind was racing. Then a realization slowly washed over me and chilled me to the bone. We watched the tape and saw the man enter my home, but we never saw him leave. I froze, then started shaking. I needed to get to the front door. I sat up and looked around the room. I couldn't see anyone. I swung my legs over the side of the bed cautiously. My feet hit the cold wood floor and I felt warm breath on my ankles. I raced out of my apartment as fast as I could and to the safety of the police officer. He called for backup. They found the man under my bed, clutching a knife and a Polaroid camera. Story 2. A friend of mine was remembering her childhood. She and her brother were playing at their home, and her mother and aunt were in the kitchen making lunch. As the kids were running around the house playing, the girl sees an old woman sitting in the living room. The old woman looks up at the girl and smiles. The girl can still hear her mother in the kitchen, and her brother playing outside. The old woman, still smiling, beckons the girl over to her chair and says, "Sweetie, your mother is very tired in taking care of you. She's tired and sick of having you around the house. Nobody here wants or loves you, and you have to come with me. You're going to live with me now." The old woman reaches out to grab the girl's arm and the mother calls from the kitchen. The girl runs into the kitchen and tells her mom in tears about the old woman in the living room. They go look and the woman is gone. Those social workers are crafty motherfuckers. Story 3. This happened to me, and it still freaks me out when I'm home alone. When I was 16 a few summers ago, my parents went out for the day, and my sister left to go out too. I lived in an average small suburban neighborhood. I was stuck in the house, bored with my dog with nobody else home. It was really hot in the living room, so I turned on the air conditioner. For that to happen, I need to open the garage door, because the butt of the air conditioner faces in there and the garage gets overheated. Usually when we do this, we lock the garage door that leads into the living room, but this one time I forgot. I sat down in my room and relaxed, not thinking much of it. Bad idea. A few hours later in the living room, I hear my dog barking like a maniac. I almost ignored it, but went into the living room and heard the doorknob on the garage door jiggling. I assumed that my sister came home, so I yelled, "It's not locked!" She didn't respond back. The doorknob jiggled more violently. I walked in and went to the door yelling again, "It's not..." When the door opened, It felt like slow motion. The door creaked open a sliver of crack, and that's all I needed to see. I just saw the feet. Huge dark brown hiking boots of a man, not my sister. I immediately pushed on the door to close it again and started screaming and crying hysterically. I'm a small girl, but I struggled to push it to shut and locked it. He started pounding on the door, but then it stopped. Hysterically crying and screaming, I scooped up my dog and ran into the kitchen to get a knife. When I went into the kitchen, I heard the gate in the backyard open and quick footsteps down the cement path. Like in the horror movies, with tears streaming down my face, I screamed, "No!" Dog in one hand and knife in the other, I threw the knife on the floor and ran to lock the back door. When I quickly bent down on the kitchen floor to pick up the knife, my legs were shaking from being so scared. My weak legs gave out and I fell forward almost onto my face. I tried to scramble to my feet, but ended up crawling and tripping on the kitchen floor, and I accidentally scratched a long shallow cut in my bare foot with the knife. I hid under the dining room table and said my prayers. I thought this was it. This is how I'm going to die. Here in the quiet, empty house with my dog as a witness. I held my mouth to cover my crying when I heard footsteps approach the back door. My heart was racing a million beats a minute, and I had the knife tightly clenched in my hand as I waited for him to make his next move. I saw his shadow through the blinds looking to the window. He stood there for a while, and then walked out. The police never found him. To this day, I always make sure the door is locked when the garage door is open. I don't know what would have happened if my dog didn't bark and alerted me that there was a man trying to break in. I would have been in my room completely unaware until it was too late. Story 4. It's late. There are 3 people on a subway train sitting in a row. 2 men and a woman in the middle. A teenage gal walks in the subway and sits across from the 3 strangers. The woman in the middle has an expressionless look on her face while the 2 men are staring directly into the teenager's eyes. Shortly after, a businessman enters the subway and sits next to the teenager. After a few minutes, he pulls out his notepad and writes, "Get off the next stop. Trust me." When the next stop comes, the teenager and the businessman get up to exit the cab when the 2 men verbally try to stop them. When they get off, the man explains to the teenager that the woman in the middle of the 2 men was dead, and that they were after her next. I heard this when I was in 7th grade and it always freaked me out. Story 5. In rural southern Illinois, a toy company began selling realistic baby dolls to expectant mothers. But apparently after the mother had her child, the toy baby would start crying. Eventually the rocking motion advertised to calm it down wouldn't work, and you couldn't get it to stop without shaking it. Eventually when it started crying, the parent would have to beat it, and even the beatings and thrashings would have to get harder and harder to get it to be quiet. The only thing that seemed to shut the baby doll up permanently was to bash its head against the wall to destroy whatever mechanism triggered the crying. On more than one occasion, though, neighbors called the authorities to report child abuse, and when the police arrived, they found the bloody remains of infants smeared across the walls and the floor. In most cases, the mother couldn't understand why the police were there. She said that she had just got rid of the stupid doll. She calmly stated as she rocked a baby-shaped bundle in her arms. Story 6. Girl babysitting late at night. She sees a dude outside of the sliding glass door and calls the cops. The cops come and see that there are muddy footprints inside the house. The dude wasn't outside, he was inside. What the babysitter saw was his reflection. Shudder. Story 7. I got to a nice Catholic church with my parents on occasion. They enjoy the early mass, so I went to the 7 o'clock service. I've known the priests for quite some time and am on a personal basis with them, even though I no longer am a regular. I was shooting the shit with the priest as he was saying goodbye to families and preparing for the next service. He normally asks how you are, etc. One such couple he did not recognize, so I talked to them as I stood by. He asked who they were and how they were doing. With the saddest look of fighting to keep her tears back, she informed us of their situation. Their son was recently killed in the Aurora shootings. This was but the day after, and our whole town was still in shock. He went aside with them, so I left bummed out about the situation. I came back a week later and talked with a priest. He helped the family through the process of losing their son, the funeral, emotions. He also had to bless their son before taking him to the mortuary. The parents were advised that no matter how hard it was to not see their son for the last time, they should avoid it. He was shot in the head. The priest told me that when he went to bless the body, nothing was really done. Not that anything could be done. Brain matter, blood, the lack of half a face. He said a final goodbye to the son for the parents, blessed him and left. It isn't necessarily a scary story, but the look in the priest's eyes scared the shit out of me. They went right through me as he explained it. He was still seeing it. I almost felt like I could see it in his eyes. I will never forget that look ever. Story 8. I had a friend that grew up deep in the Appalachia. He once admitted that as a child, he would sometimes look up from his bed at night to see a green face watching him. It would move its mouth like it was saying something, but it was silent. He would always try to convince himself he was dreaming and would rattle off prayers until he fell asleep. Never did anything other than watch him, so he eventually discounted it as a normal phenomenon of dream time. He switched rooms a few times as he got older, and strangely, he'd stop seeing the face. But when he'd move back into that room, the face would return. He'd never told anyone. His family was deeply religious, so he wanted to avoid any freakouts about demons or the devil. After college, he and his brother were reminiscing, and he finally asked his brother, "When you were staying in that room, did you ever see—" To which his brother interrupted, "A green face?" He said he turned white because he'd really convinced himself it wasn't real. Both of them were too nervous to talk about it more except to confirm it was just a green face that watched them and mumbled inaudibly. After visiting home, they refused to sleep in that room. There's something super creepy about a disembodied voyeur. Story 9. A young girl is playing in her bedroom and she hears her mother call to her from the kitchen, so she runs downstairs to meet her mother. As she's running through the hallway, the door to the cupboard under the stairs open, and a hand reaches out and pulls her in. It's her mother. She whispers to the child, "Don't go into the kitchen. I heard it too." Story 10. I once had a friend tell me about a girl she knew who met up with a guy she met on some online dating site. They met for dinner, and afterward he walked her to her car. He kept trying to get her to go home with him. She declined all invites, and eventually they kissed goodnight and went to their separate ways. A few days later, she gets some weird bumps on her lips and goes to the doctor. After examining her, the doctor seems legitimately worried and asks her about her most recent romantic encounter, because what she has is some sort of bacteria or something on her lips that you can only get from a decomposing body. Long creepy ass story short, the internet guy gets busted with like 4 dead female bodies in his apartment that he had been going down on and having sex with. Could be total bullshit, but that story creeped me the fuck out for weeks. Story 11. I'm a camp counselor, and I told a variation of the Slenderman story where he's a traditional fae that followed colonists to the New World and went insane and started killing people by stalking the naughty children who stayed out late. Oh, and by the way, my gimmick as a storyteller is that all my stories are true. And I worked up to this story over 4 weeks, starting with a tame shit, and I ended with that. All my campers were crying, as were some of my coworkers. I scared myself so much that I refused to leave my cabin after full dark for the remaining 3 days I was there. Story 12. A man is driving on a regular route along the highway when he notices a turnoff that will take him up through the mountains. He figures he drives this way all the time but has never taken the mountain path, even though it will only take him a few hours longer to reach his destination. As a spur-of-the-moment decision, he takes the turn and begins his journey up the winding road. He'd started his drive later in the day than usual, so the sky is getting dark as he approaches the top, but the view is gorgeous. While he continues, he gets a small chill up the base of his neck, but dismisses it as the cool mountain air. Not long after, he has to slow his car as he approaches what appears to be a nasty car accident. 2 cars completely totaled, looking like they hit each other head-on just after rounding a corner. The man can see a few bodies on the ground, all bloodied and not moving. Immediately he knows he has to pull over and help, but he can't stop some sixth sense telling him something about the scene is wrong, like it isn't natural. He decides he's going to drive his car forward and park it just beyond the crash site before getting out to help. He slowly creeps by the wreck and manages a better look at one of the bodies. It's definitely human, but something seems amiss, but he still can't place it. He rolls the car forward maybe 6 meters from the crash site. As he's about to come to a stop and open his door to investigate, he looks out his front windshield for a moment. It's gone terribly dark now, nearly pitch black, when something in his rearview mirror catches his eye. Several somethings, in fact. As he gazes into the mirror in horror, he can see the bodies of the crash site illuminated by his rear lights. All of them are sitting up, staring directly at his car, eyes like glowing orbs in the mirror. He panics as suddenly more people come out from the ditches and forests surrounding the road, but only when the crash victim bodies begin to stand, seemingly fine, no limps or dragging themselves, does he have the presence of mind to throw the car back into drive. By the time the first people are taking careful steps toward the vehicle, he's already speeding as fast as he can around the bend and getting the hell out of the mountain. Nothing ever came for him, nor did it seem he was ever followed. Sometimes he wonders if his mind played a trick on him, but still, to this day, he always checks his rearview mirror before ever stepping out of the car. Story 13. A girl in her teens gets called upon to babysit some kids on a Friday evening. Apparently, she watches those 2 girls pretty regularly. Anyway, the parents leave for the evening and said they wouldn't be home until around midnight. The teenager puts the 2 young girls to bed around 9 p.m. She does what most people would do, goes downstairs and watches TV for a while. She watches TV for an hour or so, and by this point, it's getting pretty late. She's in the living room on the main level, and the TV sits in the corner of the room, with large windows on each side of it. Suddenly, out of the corner of her eyes, she sees what she thinks is someone walking by the window outside through the bushes. Naturally, she gets pretty freaked out. She ends up calling 911 and the police arrive. The police checked outside, but don't find any signs of anyone walking around. I guess it was winter with the snow on the ground. The police officers assure her she's safe and that the lighting from both the TV and lamp probably played tricks on her by reflecting off the window. The teen agrees that's probably what it was, yet asks them to check inside the house for her just to be safe. The police reluctantly oblige and start randomly checking rooms, closets, and the garage a bit haphazardly. They roll their eyes a bit as they wonder how much this girl's imagination has run wild. Well, it turns out they find a man hiding underneath one of the little girl's beds. I guess as the story goes, it was the little girl's mother's ex-husband. The babysitter didn't see someone walk past the window outside. What she saw was the reflection of him walking behind the couch. Story 14. So back in the 1970s, my mom was a teenager living in Houston. She and her 9 siblings lived in the Heights, which she says is a nice neighborhood now, but at the time was something of a slum. Her family was super poor. Anyways, my mom had a crush on one of her brother's friends. She was around 14 or 15 at the time. He was a few years older, but she was in love. His name was Mark. Well, around this time, boys started disappearing from the neighborhood. They weren't leaving notes or telling anyone that they were leaving. The families were calling the police, but the police weren't doing anything about it. They decided that the boys had run away and never really looked into it further. After all, these were poor kids living in a bad neighborhood. They ran away all the time. Life goes on. One day, Mark disappears too. Meanwhile, my mom's younger brother was hitching a ride out to the beach to go fishing. He did this on a regular basis and would bum a ride from anyone. On the way to the beach, the guy driving the car stops to fill up the gas tank. The guy working at the gas station, Mom says they called him Weird Larry, sees my uncle and asks who he's with. My uncle replies that he doesn't actually know the guy. Larry won't let my uncle go any further and makes him get out of the car. The driver goes on without him. Now then, 3 years have passed since the boys started disappearing, and they finally find out what happened. A man had been paying 2 boys to lure teenage boys to his house, where he drugged them, strapped them to a wooden board, tortured them, raped them, and killed them. There were at least 28 victims, and Mark Scott was one of them. The only reason they found out was that the 2 teenagers murdered the serial killer, then told the police about all of the murders and led them to some of the bodies. And guess who picked up my uncle that day he was going fishing?